I planned my route to drive on interesting secondary roads and avoid the interstates. I wanted to see things more appealing than highway signs, trucks, and rest areas. Being newly retired, I can enjoy not being in a hurry. I used the website myscenicdrives.com and the Rand McNally Road Atlas to help me plan my route and Garmin Basecamp software to load it into my GPS. After the first night in Scranton, Pennsylvania, I went to Ricketts Glen State Park in Adams Falls, then continued along rural Pennsylvania roads to spend a night in Cumberland, Maryland. The next morning I went to Seneca Rock State Park in West Virginia that I was surprised to learn is one of the premier rock climbing locations in the eastern U.S. Then on to the National Radio Astronomy Observatory in Green Bank, West Virginia, where I took a fascinating guided tour. Green Bank is a radio quiet zone and no cell phones or wireless devices are allowed in the town. Even microwave ovens are monitored to prevent interference with the huge and very sensitive radio telescopes. After a night in Lewisburg, West Virginia, I drove to Fairfield Glade, Tennessee, where I spent the weekend visiting friends. Then on to Chattanooga for the first of 4 Road Scholar trips. I had a great time in Chattanooga, and there's a link to my Best of Chattanooga video at the end of this video. After my week in Chattanooga, I went to Cherokee, North Carolina, where I visited the very well-done Museum of the Cherokee Indian and the Great Smoky Mountains National Park Visitors Center. After spending the night in Cherokee, I took sections of the Blue Ridge Parkway to Boone, North Carolina. After a night in Boone, I drove to Williamsburg, Virginia for my next week-long Road Scholar trip that included Colonial Williamsburg, Yorktown Battlefield, and the Jamestown Settlement. Jamestown was my favorite. Lots of interesting history there, like imagining the Native Americans seeing the European ships coming up the river, and how the settlement managed to survive. There were excellent replicas of 3 ships that brought settlers from England to Virginia. It was incredible to think of spending 4.5 months crossing the Atlantic on those ships. After a week in Williamsburg, I spent a night in Roanoke and visited the Virginia Museum of Transportation, with especially good exhibits on railroads and automobiles. Then on to Pembroke, Virginia for my Road Scholar trip about birding in the Appalachians. The trip was based at Mountain Lake Lodge, where much of the movie Dirty Dancing was filmed. I arrived during the annual Mountains of Misery bicycle race. Definitely some misery on those hills. I knew nothing about birding, so that was a really entertaining week of learning. After the birding week, I drove towards the New River Gorge and stopped at Sandstone Falls. I'd been through this area several times on one of my favorite trains, Amtrak's Cardinal, and was looking forward to driving through the area. I even got to see the Cardinal stopped at the Hinton Rail Station. After a night in Oak Hill, West Virginia, I explored the New River Gorge Bridge and the Visitor Center and drove the very scenic Fayette Station Road. Then some classic Appalachian hilly twisting roads on my way to a night outside Richmond in Short Pump, Virginia. By now I was getting used to the curvy roads with steep drop-offs and no shoulders or guardrails. The next morning I headed to the 23-mile-long Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel. That's an exciting, and some say scary, combination of bridges, tunnels, and artificial islands that crosses the mouth of the bay. At the end of the eastern side there was an observation area where it was fun to stop and watch ghost crabs scuttling around on the sand. There was also a variety of seabirds, including flying squadrons of pelicans. Then I spent some time at the Eastern Shore Virginia National Wildlife Refuge, on my way to Crisfield, Maryland, and my next week-long Road Scholar trip. 2 highlights were trips to Tangier and Smith Islands. Both have long histories and are slowly disappearing due to rising sea levels.
Ahead of us and to our left and right, you will see some buildings on poles. Those are all crab shanties. That's where they shed the soft-shell crabs during the summer months. Also see some crab pots stacked up on the docks and get a much better view of some of the workboats that they use.
The next day we went to Smith Island. Tom Horton's book, An Island Out of Time, gives a really nice accounting of the disappearing way of life on the island.
The Bayside Inn Restaurant. That's where we'll be having lunch today. good food out here on Smith Island. You really enjoy.
Catching, cooking, eating, and fisheries management of blue crabs were also highlights of this Rhodes Scholar trip. The Crisfield trip ended at noon, and I went to Elkton, Maryland to spend the night. The next day I took an interesting assortment of back roads to Hopewell Furnace National Historic Site. Originally built in 1771, this was an entire community of workers and buildings all dedicated to the operation of one blast furnace. The early Pennsylvania iron industry thrived because of its location. In addition to good sources of iron ore, the area had abundant forests. It took an acre of woodlands to produce enough charcoal to run a blast furnace for just one day. The park and visitor center were really well done. Lots of very interesting technical and sociological information. The furnace community was almost feudal in nature. There was a hierarchy of workers with the ironmaster at the top, then the founder, who was the foreman running the furnace, followed by charcoal makers, iron ore miners, woodcutters, and many others who kept the place running. There was a company store and rental housing for workers and a school for their children. More than 100 years after it was built, the furnace ended operations in 1883, primarily because of new technologies and steel production. After Hopewell Furnace, I visited the Franklin Mineral Museum in Franklin, New Jersey. They had a great exhibit of fluorescent minerals and a life-size walk-through replica of the zinc mines in the area. After spending the night in Middletown, New York, the next morning I got onto the interstates for a 5-hour run back home to Rochester, New Hampshire, and the end of an outstanding month-long road trip.